Good morning, everyone. My name is Mayra Lombera, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer with the Michelson 20mm Foundation, and it's my privilege to welcome everyone today. Thank you all so much for joining us for part 5 of our Connecting California series. Before we get started with today's program, I just want to share a bit about our foundation and briefly preview what we have in store for you today. So the Michelson 20mm Foundation was founded by Dr. Gary K. Michelson and Alia Michelson to ensure that equitable post-secondary educational opportunities that lead to meaningful careers are accessible to all, especially our most vulnerable populations. We proudly operate at the cutting edge of higher education to help forward-thinking innovators, nonprofits, and startups close the opportunity gap. Our Connecting California series is but one example of a project that launched approximately 10 months ago as part of our digital equity initiative to increase awareness about the digital divide. Our events to date have showcased a range of themes, including a brief history of digital inequity, its root causes, potential long-term solutions, and even uplifted exemplars from across the country of public-private partnerships whose cross-sectoral efforts are really making a difference for communities and people in need. We've also taken a closer look at the transformative impact that the Biden-Harris administration can have on this issue during what we all know is one of our most trying times. But we could not have done any of this alone. And for that, we'd like to thank our partners and panelists who have shared their time and expertise with us all. Experts like Catherine DeWitt from the Pew Charitable Trust, Gigi Song from the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, Ernesto Falcon from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Lande Ajose, who's a senior policy advisor for higher education in the office of Governor Newsom, and the superintendent of public instruction, Tony Thurman. All of these individuals have contributed to our events, and we are truly thankful to each and every single one of them. Our convenings have also provided a forum for philanthropic leaders to explore or redefine their role and relationship to the digital divide. We've looked at both long-term and near-term solutions to meet the immediate needs of individuals, all of which have only been exacerbated by COVID-19. So if this is your first time tuning in, we invite you to visit our website at 20mm.org, where you'll be able to access all past events. But I have one more thing to say, and that's that one of our most proudest accomplishments is by and large been made possible thanks to all of you who are joining us here today. In a mere few months, we've been able to convene and more deeply engage with over 70 foundations from California and beyond, and hundreds of program officers, staffers, advocates, nonprofits, and elected officials. Through Connecting California, we have seeded a really strong coalition of private and public sector leaders who have come together to coalesce around a shared agenda for achieving digital equity once and for all. So thank you. Today's conversation will build on our commitment to bringing the best and brightest minds together to get us ever so closer to meeting the 21st century needs of our citizens. So without further ado, welcome to The Power of Connectivity, How Internet Innovators Are Closing the Digital Divide. Just one more final housekeeping item before we delve into our program. I just want to remind everyone that you'll be able to ask questions via the Zoom Q&A function, which we highly encourage you to do, as we'll dedicate the last portion of today's event to answering your questions. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Michelson, founder and co-chair of the Michelson 20mm Foundation, who will be sharing welcoming remarks for today's program.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for sharing your time with us for this important conversation. It is today abundantly clear that we cannot look to our incumbent internet service providers to bridge the very digital divide that they have helped to create. According to the FCC, still more than 21 million people remain unconnected without access to critical educational, workforce, and medical resources, while still others remain, for a lack of a better way to say it, inadequately connected. This includes more than a quarter of all the people who live in our rural communities. Both in response to and in defiance of the monopolies established by the ISPs, innovative connectivity solutions such as municipal broadband networks and cooperatives have emerged as viable alternatives for the most underserved community. Community coalitions around the United States are developing their own solutions or partnering with independent service providers who are focused on more than just profits. Unfortunately, at the same time, the major ISPs have been doing everything they can to impede further competition and to maintain their strangleholds on the market. Due to their unopposed and incredibly well-financed lobbying efforts, over 20 states have enacted anti-municipal broadband laws preventing, impeding, or discouraging the development of publicly owned internet networks. The ISPs have spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars at the federal level and within the states to have it their way. While it might be good for their business, it is not in our best interest to allow them to use our laws to deny our communities the opportunity to establish their own means of connecting to the internet. This is even more true in regard to our rural communities, which they have abandoned. We must look beyond the short-term fix of subsidies, especially at retail prices set by these providers that are wholly unrelated to any actual cost and which would actually reward their bad behavior while further aligning their pockets. We must instead, as Governor Newsom boldly posited last Friday, build that middle mile, build that last mile, and get this done once and for all by making catalytic investments that will pay dividends for generations and end the scourge that is the digital divide. I welcome and thank the innovators on today's panel because they have been at the forefront of building solutions, developing new technologies, and galvanizing strategic partnerships to expand universal, affordable, broadband internet access. Thanks for joining us today and enjoy the conversation.
A big thank you to Dr. Michelson for his vision and commitment to digital equity and for always pushing us to think outside of the box. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome Miguel Leon, Program Officer at Michelson 20mm, who oversees our digital equity initiative and is responsible for bringing us all together and building this incredible community. Miguel?
Thank you so much, Mayra. Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. As Mayra mentioned, my name is Miguel Leon. I'm a program officer here at the Michelson 20mm Foundation. I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker today, Congressman Jerry McNerney. Congressman McNerney has served in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2007 and proudly represents California's 9th District, which includes a large portion of San Joaquin County and parts of Contra Costa and Sacramento counties. Congressman McNerney has a PhD in mathematics and is honored to serve on the Committee on Energy and Commerce, as well as the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Welcome, Congressman McNerney.
Well, thank you, Miguel, and thank you, Myra. Good morning. It's great to be joining the Michelson 2020 Foundation for the Connecting California series. I'm Congressman Jerry McNerney. I represent California's 9th Congressional District, which includes, as said, parts of Contra Costa, San Joaquin, and Sacramento counties. In Congress, I serve on the House Energy and Commerce Committee's Communication and Technology Subcommittee. This oversees telecommunications policy. I also serve as the co-chair of the Wi-Fi caucus, addressing the digital divide and making sure that everyone has broadband is something that I've long cared about and has been a priority for me in Congress. Prior to the pandemic, 34% of my constituents did not have broadband at home, and the pandemic shined a bright line on the severity of this problem. During the pandemic, there have been steps at the federal, state, and local levels to get more people connected. I'm proud of the Emergency Broadband Benefit and the Emergency Connectivity Fund that we passed in Congress, which will make a difference by helping millions of households get and stay connected during this time. But we can't stop there. As a nation, we've waited far too long to address the digital divide. It's absolutely critical that we address these challenges now. Broadband access is like rural electrification was in the last century, and it's almost a human rights issue. We can't afford to wait any longer. My colleagues and I in the House Energy and Commerce Committee have introduced the Lift America Act, which includes a bold plan for connecting everyone across the country. It would provide more than $94 billion for broadband deployment adoption, and affordability. President Biden's American Jobs Plan would provide $100 billion for broadband and seeks to address the very similar issues and goals that those in the Lift America Act do. I'd like to discuss a few things that I'm working on as a part of the broadband infrastructure legislative efforts. First, it's important that funding be made available for open access fiber networks. Several years ago, the city of Stockton, which is in my district, set out to build an open access fiber network. It would have been the largest open access network in the country, but the city wasn't able to secure necessary financing for the project, and the project could not move forward as a result of that. Earlier this year, I introduced the Broadband Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, BIFIA, which would make low interest financing available for broadband infrastructure projects like the building open access middle mile networks. BIFIA is also a part of the LIFT Act. Second, I would like to see targeted broadband infrastructure deployment funding for public housing. Far too many individuals living in public housing still lack sufficient broadband service or have no service at all. I've heard this firsthand from housing authorities in my district and across the state. A targeted grant program would help promote innovative models to deliver affordable broadband service to individuals living in public housing. I'll soon be introducing legislation to address this. Third, we must address gaps in broadband adoption and digital literacy and digital skills. I've introduced the Digital Equity Act that would establish 2 federal grant programs, one for states to create and implement digital equity plans, and one that would provide competitive grants to bridge these gaps. The Digital Equity Act is also part of Lift America Act. We can't wait any longer to address the digital divide. We must act now. I'm going to continue to work hard in Congress and make sure that we get this kind of thing done. Thanks again to Michelson 2020 Foundation for having me here today and for all the work that you're doing. It's been a real pleasure, and keep it up. We'll get this done. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman McNerney, for your words today and for your leadership on this very important issue. I now have the pleasure of introducing our illustrious panel. With us today, we have Seth Hadel. Seth is President and Chief Science Officer at the Post Road Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit that develops new models for impact investment in infrastructure to help communities build a more sustainable and equitable future. Post Road focuses particularly on structuring intelligent infrastructure projects designed to eliminate the digital divide, reduce greenhouse gas emissions through advanced electric grid technologies, and drive adoption of cutting-edge educational, healthcare, and other broadband-enabled services. With us as well, we have Joanne Hovis. Joanne is CEO at the Coalition for Local Internet Choice and President at CTC Technology and Energy. With more than 20 years of experience, Joanne is a nationally recognized authority on broadband markets and on the evolving role of public-private partnerships in the provision of communication services to the public. Joanne has testified before Congress on rural broadband, broadband public-private partnerships, and the digital divide. She has also provided expert presentations to the Federal Communications Commission, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, and other national organizations. Joanne is a member of the Board of Directors of the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, Consumer Reports, and the Fiber Broadband Association, and is a former president of the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors. We also have Bruce Patterson. Bruce is Director of Technology at Entry Point Networks. As head of Entry Point's Solution Services, Bruce assists municipalities with network planning, feasibility analysis, network design, cost projections, construction oversight, and network operations and management. Prior to Entry Point, Bruce worked at the city of Ammon, where he created and managed the Ammon Fiber Network, which has been identified as the best fiber optic network in America. We also have Preston Ray. Preston is Director of Engineering for the Policy Program at Monkey Brains. Preston has over a decade of experience in telecommunications engineering and public interest advocacy. At Monkey Brains, he coordinates partnerships with governments to build public fiber to affordable housing, breaks down barriers to affordable internet in large apartment buildings, and advances Monkey Brains' gigabit network penetration in underserved areas. Prior to joining Monkey Brains, Preston worked at Code for America, developing civic engagement practices with city governments and networks of civic technologists. Lastly, our panel will be moderated by Christopher Mitchell. Chris is director of the Community Broadband Networks Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Minneapolis. At ILSR, Mitchell created muninetworks.org, the comprehensive online clearinghouse of information about local government policies to improve internet access, whose interactive community broadband network map tracks more than 500 such networks. He also hosts audio and video shows, including Community Broadband Bits, Connect This, and Building Local Power. We're excited to have these subject matter experts with us and are confident that you will find today's conversation both enjoyable and fruitful. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Miguel. I very much appreciate this opportunity. I am very grateful to the Michelson 20mm Foundation for doing this work, for leading this work in this space, and particularly to Dr. Michelson for such a powerful introduction to this discussion. I'd also like to thank Congressman McNerney, who has been a leader on this. I very much appreciate his work on many different aspects of solving broadband challenges, and his staff's work. They've really been there to help the groups that are trying to get this done on the ground, and sought feedback and making sure that they're crafting the rules that will really help us. I'd really love to see my fellow panelists on video here. We're gonna jump in on a number of different topics. We have some folks that have really done innovative work, are really pushing the limits of what we can imagine in terms of how to solve these problems in the bold way that Dr. Michelson has charged us with. I would like to start in an area around public housing, which Congressman McNerney raised up. I think we actually did at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance did a case study on what Monkey Brains is doing in San Francisco and how I think that's informing others around the nation. So Preston, I'd like to ask you to first speak about what you're doing there, and in particular, what others should be taking away from the lessons that you've learned.
Thanks, Chris. I'm happy to talk about it. And thank you again to the Michelson 20mm Foundation for inviting us all here to talk about this crucial issue that is always is ever closer to being solved with all of our work and the work of so many more people in the country. So the program that Chris worked with Monkey Brains to document the foundation of is what is now known as the Fiber to Housing Partnership, which is a partnership between Monkey Brains, an ISP based in San Francisco, where I work, and two departments at the City and County of San Francisco, the Department of Technology and the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. In a nutshell, Fiber to Housing is a program that focuses on what Dr. Michelson highlighted early on, infrastructure, to establish infrastructure necessary to target locations, affordable housing buildings under the MOHCD portfolio. And in the combination of the Department of Technology constructing public fiber to these apartment buildings and the Mayor's Office of Housing promulgating a wiring standard for how telecom wiring should work in these buildings so that everyone has guaranteed availability of multimodal high-speed internet access direct in their units. Monkey Brains installs ISP switches. We light up that public fiber and deliver internet to every unit in all these apartment buildings that are affordable housing buildings. And there are approximately 7,000 units of affordable housing across perhaps 50 or maybe a little more than 50 affordable housing sites in San Francisco that are now fully active on the Fiber to Housing network. So the infrastructure here is one of the most, it's easily 90% of what takes so much focus. We know that the infrastructure costs the most money, especially at the core. And we know that the infrastructure is what ultimately is able to deliver a guaranteed universal high quality, high speed access. So I think that some of the lessons to take away from the fiber to housing program have to do with that focus on making sure from the origin of where the internet comes from regionally to your unit, what is the infrastructure necessary to ensure that you're going to have gigabit internet available to you all the time at no cost, especially if you're in affordable housing or otherwise any sort of means tested living situation. And that mode of transmission to you, it doesn't matter who your ISP is. It could be Monkey Brains, it could be any other ISP, but that to deliver it to you is baked in to the construction or the redevelopment of the place that you live, the place that you go to work, the place that you ideally, as we reopen the country and people are safe to congregate again, where you go to access the internet, maybe at a community center, at a community room in your building, so on and so forth. At a homeless shelter, which we also, of course, do for San Francisco's navigation centers are coming up on this public fiber network. And in the presence of that, having universal access to gigabit internet, the mayor's office is able to go even further and do critical social support for people, giving out free routers and ensuring that people are adopting the internet and not simply having access to it.
Preston, I want to ask you a quick follow-up, and then I'm going to poke Joanne to ask what she thinks is interesting in this space of public housing. But one of the things that I really learned from you, Preston, is that if you spend the money right up front, then your recurring costs can be quite low. And I think that's something that people on this call really need to hear about. So can you give us 30 seconds on that?
Definitely. If you construct fiber, which is this asset's going to last decades and decades and decades, and it's upgradable quite a bit far into the future, and you install wiring in your building that ensures that everyone is going to have this access available to them without someone having to come and run something new, like the ISP would have to do some work to do this. The amount of labor and equipment necessary for us to provide gigabit internet to every unit is minuscule. Literally an hour or so at every building just to install a switch can get 100 units up like that. In the absence of that set infrastructure to the building and within the building, the amount of work that has to be done on afterwards, whether it's digging up the street or like drilling holes in walls, what have you, it begins to add up so much. And then you're having to make decisions about where the money is going to go later on. So solving this infrastructural issue at the beginning enables the cost of labor is going to go way down, and the cost of maintaining that is going to go way down as well. And then all of your time can be spent ensuring that people are using and thriving on that infrastructure.
Joanne, I want to ask you. I want to also first note that for any participants that are watching this, if they would like to start putting questions in, I will be keeping an eye on them, making sure that we try to address them as we go through our pre-planned topics. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, more specifically, but people can throw items in the chat at any point. Now, Joanne, what is happening in the public housing or very low income space that you would like to highlight?
I think the model that's been pioneered by the city of San Francisco and by Monkey Brains, and the first efforts there were 15 years ago. It's credit to Monkey Brains and the city and the other partners who have been involved, how persistent and seriously this has been taken. I think that model is being replicated in many different places. For a city that is concerned about not just the availability of broadband, but also the affordability of broadband and access to the best possible broadband for low-income residents of that community, it's extremely efficient and impactful to put capital dollars into building infrastructure to get to affordable housing. This, by the way, is also the case for nonprofits, and increasingly affordable housing is the province of nonprofit entities as well as of public entities. And the collaborations between those two and those two entities, types of entities working together, are a critical piece of this. But I know of a dozen major cities where planning of this sort is underway and in place, where the city may not see a path forward to building fiber infrastructure everywhere, but as it prioritizes where it can build that infrastructure, it's thinking about affordable housing. And I want to just echo what Preston said about cost structures and how critical this kind of investment can be. For a public or a nonprofit entity building affordable housing, building that infrastructure to begin with is, you know, the proverbial no-brainer. The incremental costs are negligible compared to the cost of construction of the building itself. And whether we're talking about a high-rise or a mid-rise or a 4-unit building, all of those, in every scenario, you won't even notice the cost as a line item in the budget. And then the operating costs become negligible as well. But even if this requires a retrofit, and in many cities it will, because many of these buildings already exist, even so, as an investment goes, this is an enormously impactful one. To Preston's point, there's an investment with a lifetime of many, many decades. And what you're doing is you are taking a building that would be challenging for broadband purposes generally and future-proofing it and making it possible to extremely cost-effectively deliver a high-end service at potentially no cost or exceptionally low cost to the resident. One last thought on that, which is that we really recommend thinking about no cost, not low cost, or very, very low cost. But the reason I would recommend consideration of low cost is, number one, these are the folks for whom costs are most challenging, and the model for a city should never be based on revenues. It's not going to work. If the goal is revenues, you're in the wrong business. That's sort of the starting point. And then the second part of that is, when you're talking about a no-cost product, it removes an entire layer of operating cost and makes for a much more economically viable model, because you no longer have to think about things like marketing and sales, billing and collections, staffing customer service people who are just there to argue with folks about their bills. And we all know that that's a huge part of what customer service is really about. It's not service, it's trying to fix bad bills. It's just a much simpler model that's dedicated to actually providing service rather than to all of the very costly elements of operating that are about driving revenues. So I think that this is an incredibly promising area and will hopefully be one of enormous engagement for communities across the country.
Thank you, Joanne. And I think that that issue about whether or not the cost of collecting $10 a month or so from someone is worth it is a very important point. I had suggested people should ask questions in the chat. I should say, please ask questions in the Q&A. We are going to not leave the digital divide and low income access and public housing behind. We want to keep it infused in our discussion. But I want to ask one last thing about it, and I'll just see anyone that's interested. I think some people feel that having robust Wi-Fi in the hallways is sufficient for some of these buildings. And I'm curious if anyone wants to just not dwell on it, but to respond with whether or not that is sufficient moving forward.
I'll happily jump in since no one jumped in quickly. I mean, and this is a problem that trying to solve that problem is what developed the origin of the wiring standard that I discussed in fiber to housing. I think that I've been in situations in single resident occupancy hotels in the Tenderloin district and in the South of Market area in San Francisco, where there's a Wi-Fi there's a Wi-Fi node outside of someone's door, and the moment you walk halfway into their door, the signal drops to 0.2 megabytes from literally 80 megabytes per second. And I've canvassed people for smart Wi-Fi designs, but ultimately it comes down to this: universal service and universal accessibility requires a universal infrastructure plan that is equivalent for everyone. And there is no doubt that a wire to your unit is that very clearly. It allows you, the person in the unit, to then take that and do as you please with it. which of course reduces the challenge for a central operator beyond the walls of the building. And furthermore, getting to the point where you have wires to every unit is simply a substrate to also have wires in the hallway for Wi-Fi and wires in the community center for hallway. So I would recommend thinking of it rather as not, Wi-Fi is not a great substitute for universal service, but Wi-Fi is a very important and I think necessary, especially in larger settings, amenity to have on top of, and that is enabled by that universal standard of service direct to every dwelling unit and every community room and so on and so forth.
Chris, can I add something to that?
You can.
Thanks. What I would say is that the technical in-building solution needs to be based on what exists in the building. If we are building affordable housing from scratch, it is a given that there should be fiber to every single unit and everywhere possible, with all of the infrastructure developed for Wi-Fi in addition to that for distribution, just like we all have in our homes, right? I have a wire to my home and then I have Wi-Fi distribution within my home. And if I think that's what's appropriate for my kids, that's what should be appropriate for everybody's kids. And that's a given when we're building anew. If what we're talking about is retrofitting in existing buildings, then there needs to be a serious engineering effort done to figure out what's the best way to do this that meets the budget. And that might mean using existing wiring with certain kinds of technologies, using robust Wi-Fi capabilities, and not necessarily retrofitting fiber to every unit, although that would be optimal. But that's the engineering analysis that has to be done on a case-by-case basis. What I think is really a problem is the idea that this is going to be easy and cheap. We're just going to throw up some Wi-Fi in the hallways of all these buildings and we're done. There's a cheap solution to this. That is not the case. It's not going to be cheap under any circumstances, even if the technology, even if the infrastructure is not fiber to the unit, in order to get the level of capability and reliability that we would want. It may be something else, but it's going to take serious effort. So if Wi-Fi is seen as some kind of an end run around effort and cost, then I think it's ill-conceived.
And I think we've had two different discussions. In most of the buildings, I believe Preston has run Cat 5e or Cat 6 cabling, or fiber would be an option. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that in this call, but I wanted to make sure that people had a sense that there's a variety of high quality wired solutions. Bruce, I just kind of saw your eyebrows go up a bit at kind of this talk about getting it right on the front end. And I want to move into more of a discussion about municipal networks. You have developed a particular flavor, which we don't have the time to fully explore. But as you're looking at different communities that are considering municipal networks, why is that an interesting approach? Why are you going to spend so much of your time working on that model?
Well, I think public infrastructure is really going to play a key role in moving us past where we are. I think that we all recognize, it was already stated in our opening comments, that there's a very successful effort to maintain some monopolies. So not only is there resistance to any kind of rate control that would level the playing field a little bit, but there's also resistance to competition. So you have both those things. And municipalities really want to engage in this. I think there's will, but part of the challenge is policy tends to come from the top down, and the change, the innovation, and what we're going to do to fix the problem is coming from the bottom up. And as these municipalities, the local communities try and give voice to how they want to solve their own problem, and frankly, they're willing to pay for it themselves, they find that they don't have the authority from the powers that be. So it's fun to work with some of these municipalities. Some of them have the ability to really change the dynamic. And we believe that a lot of the solutions are going to come from that. And we need to take a very long-term view. You heard infrastructure was the biggest cost. That's been proven to us in Ammon. And you can look at what California is talking about doing. They're looking at long-term investments with low interest. Having that money available to build public infrastructure would go a long, long ways to solving the problem we have.
Now, I think we don't want to take it as a granted that that everyone on this call knows what Ammon did, although shame on them, because this is Ammon, Idaho we're talking about here. Tell us in brief what you've done.
So the city basically has no debt. I think that's a key aspect. So the residents have found a way through an improvement district to aggregate their willpower and collect their funds. Everybody pays equally. And we're going into brownfield, so existing buildings in the city of Ammon, and they're funding the build of the infrastructure to their homes. And that's a one-time cost. They can pay for it all at once, or the city will help them get a municipal bond. They can pay for it over 15 or 20 years at a low interest rate. I think it's important at this point to mention, though, Preston touched on this. It was kind of tied into what Joanne said already. It needs to be baked in going forward. And that's one of the big areas I think we're really failing at, is we're seeing a lot of new construction, new homes being built. We see that in Ammon. And when it's made clear to these developers and these builders the very small incremental cost that it takes to get fiber to every home being built going forward, they voluntarily do it. And so what we found in Ammon is it's voluntary, but every single new home in Ammon has a fiber built to it. And there is no capital cost because it's paid when the home is bought, purchased. And so those residents are paying the city $16.50 a month for maintenance and operation of the fiber. They can get 1 gig for as low as $10 a month. So for really under $27 a month out of pocket, they get 1 gig internet with no data cap and no contract, because that investment was made when the home was built and when the development was built. That's how you're going to accomplish that.
Thank you. Now I'm gonna bring Seth in, because I'm missing your voice. And Congressman McInerney spoke about open access. One of the things that's notable about Ammon is open access. So Seth, what is open access? Why is this important?
Well, I think open access can do a few things. Bruce and his team has really pioneered it in the practical application, but it can allow for competition on a network, which can lower costs and improve services. We think some of the most exciting part of open access is the ability to bring different types of services into the same physical network. And so you can have innovation across sectors that are traditionally siloed. And we don't know where that innovation would go, but it can't be bad, right? The innovation is what creates value and what's powered the American economy for so many decades. So we're excited about innovation in open access networks that can, say, combine energy applications and healthcare type applications in the network itself in a way that would be difficult to do, if you're partnering with a monopoly, an incumbent, or a siloed network. So if a community were to own the network in this open access way, whether that's a municipality, whether that's a cooperative, or whether that's some other entity, not a governmental entity, but some sort of private entity, but that owns it and operates it for the community benefit on an open access network, you can envision all sorts of new innovative applications arising that hospitals could take advantage of, that schools could take advantage of, all these sorts of things. And that plays into also the low income discussion. If a household, if they in some way struggle to pay their property tax, that doesn't mean their kids don't go to school. But yet that's how often the internet service is provided in this country. If you don't pay your broadband bill, then you get cut off from the internet, and then your kids can't do learning. They can't do remote learning. So, open access where a community in some way owns and operates it and can combine and yet also in some sense segregate these different applications, we think that has a lot of potential benefits.
Yep. One of the things that I think of with regard to open access is if I'm a large hospital operation and I'm thinking, I want to try this app out. And am I going to go to a national cable company to say, hey, will you do this pilot project and give me this access to your network in ways that you don't give to anyone else? And I suspect they would not even return the call. These networks, when open access, they're inviting that kind of thing in, right? They're trying to make it easy for people to plug in and do interesting things.
I think that's right. I mean, they might return the call, but they would struggle with understanding why they should partner. Right, because not only just you put the app on your phone and you can use their network, what's the big deal? But that's right. I think that for hospitals and for schools, there's opportunities to use this open access network technology to pioneer new ways of interacting that's not tied to internet access.
So I want to direct the first question to you to clarify something, which is that I feel like we start talking about this. I think people might assume that we're talking about dense urban areas that are going to be getting these kinds of open access networks. Tell us a little about what Post Road Foundation is doing to not focus on those dense urban areas.
Well, we focus on rural and redlined, digitally redlined urban areas. We're sort of agnostic as to where it is. We just want to bring broadband to those parts of the country that don't have it. Open access can play a role in rural parts or rural areas. It doesn't. I don't think that the density really makes much of a difference. It is, if you're looking at it from an ISP competition point of view, the ability to attract internet service providers to an open access network does depend on the number of subscribers on that network. So, if, in rural areas, that can be a challenge. That point doesn't really pertain to the innovation point, where you could have local electric utilities, hospitals, and schools using the network for their own purposes to directly interact with residents.
Now, Joanne, I'm curious if you want to talk not so much about open access, but more about the municipal networks. What are we seeing that's innovative and is changing some of these problems that we've been wrestling with for a long time on the municipal front?
Chris, I think what we're seeing is new models emerging, or existing models seeing new innovation around various kinds of public-private collaboration. We are certainly seeing a remarkable dynamic of localities considering what it involves for them to be in the infrastructure business only, where they build the fiber asset, and variations on what Bruce was describing is happening in the communities where he works, including in Ammon, but the community in an infrastructure role with a partner, sometimes private for profit, sometimes private nonprofit, sometimes another public entity, as the operator and service provider on that network. And this allows communities to focus on what for many of them is a core capability and a real expertise on infrastructure, public works, et cetera, and to find a partner who has service delivery capabilities and who's interested in marketing and sales, billing and collections, delivery of services, innovation around services, et cetera, which some communities are not interested in doing themselves. Many are, and certainly they should be in a position to do so if they would like to. So that's something I think that we're seeing considered in a range of different ways around the country, each one customized to local needs and circumstances. The other dynamic that I think is really interesting is communities seeing themselves maybe not even on the infrastructure side, but more on the financing or funding side with partners for design, construction, maintenance, operations, service provision of some sort or another, where they are willing to take some level of financial risk while offsetting a substantial amount of that risk to a partner, but bringing in their ability to access the capital markets at very low cost, or grant or other funds that they may have access to, in order to create opportunities for new infrastructure deployment by their partners, whether that partner might be for profit or not.
Joanne, sorry, let me ask you, because I love, we have this relationship in which we both interrupt each other over drinks. Is the most fun. You're speaking about these generalities. Tell us a story about one of the communities that has done this, if you're able to. You don't have to tell us which one it is, but I think it'd be interesting to see it through their eyes.
Sure, I tend to do that with generalities, and don't hesitate to interrupt me at any time, Chris, because I think you know that.
Oh, I won't.
You don't. I might just go on and on and on. All right, so let me, well, how about if I share a handful of different examples, some of them newer, some of them shorter.
Sure, if they're quick, you can't filibuster the rest of this.
Very briefly, I promise. Okay, so first major initiative of this type was Westminster, Maryland. More than a decade ago, the city, which is not itself a municipal electric utility, but is a small community with a hunger for best-in-class infrastructure, built fiber to pass every single location in the city, and also funded the drops. Went through a competitive process to bring in a private partner and selected Ting Internet, and has had an exceptional relationship and experience with Ting for the past close to a decade. I think we're at 7 or 8 years at this point. And Ting has been this marvelous partner in a whole bunch of different ways, including being part of development of other kinds of community assets around economic development and technology. But this is now a city that has infrastructure comparable to that in Singapore and Austin, Texas, and it's a small outer suburb of Baltimore. Proven economics, very low risk, shared risk with a private partner. And the city's in the infrastructure business, not in the service provision business, not taking market risk for the most part. More recently, we've seen a handful of initiatives in New England where the incumbent local exchange carrier, and by the way, if you'd asked me 5 years ago whether an incumbent phone company would enter into these kinds of partnerships, I would have said, no, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Right, that's the telephone company that's been around forever, that has usually an established way of doing business.
Yes, indeed. So the incumbent phone company in this case in New England is Consolidated Communications, and has entered into what I think are some really interesting partnerships with small towns in New Hampshire, and I see this spreading to other states where Consolidated has operations, where the financing is coming from the town, but Consolidated is making commitments around guaranteeing debt service. So the town is really not taking market risk. Consolidated is doing the construction and operations. So the town is really not taking construction risk either. What the town is doing is committing its balance sheet as a tool for getting low-cost financing and allowing Consolidated in that way to expand to new communities with fiber to the premises. These are small towns, but that's a pretty creative partnership that is win-win for both of those entities. That this is the sort of thing that I think we're going to see a lot more of. Oh, and by the way, in the Consolidated case, the town ultimately owns that infrastructure in some of the cases. In others, we're seeing models around the country where the town is happy to transfer ownership at the end of the financing term to their private partner. And that should be their call. If they want to do that, then that would be fine. But this is an interesting low risk way to get fiber to the premises in your community. If you have
and I want to give Bruce a chance, because I feel like Bruce might be grinding his teeth away to little nubs, because in Bruce's point of view, I think like this isn't about just getting the latest technology out to places. And I'll say that I've written positively about what's happening in New Hampshire with this. I think cities should be able to make these decisions. But Bruce, I feel like your work is one of saying, if we're going to make these investments, let's like make sure it results in competition and a structural change in the market. So what's your case in terms of how cities should be looking at this when they move forward?
So I'm going to make kind of a philosophical comment here that's probably a little more personal, which is if we're going to take public money, then it needs to remain public infrastructure. But that's just a base feeling, okay? So I feel like we've taken public money and we've funded private infrastructure that's now operated for profit and not put any controls or mechanisms. That's a huge mistake. We've done that over and over again.
And to clarify, that is the case in some of the examples that Joanne cited, so not all of them.
But I think that in substance, Joanne hit on some really important things, which are we are getting much, much better at separating a lot of these functions. And we recognize that there are entities that are better equipped for the financing. There might be an entity that's better equipped for the construction. And there might be an entity that's better equipped for the operations. And I think you have to look at the community and ask yourselves, what is the best financial situation? In other words, if the city wants to build it and own it, that should be the best financial situation for those that are going to pay for it. And then if the city says, well, we don't know we really want to operate it, well, then that should go through kind of the process might be an RFP process where you take a look at who's out there available to do it, what does it cost, and what would it take for the city if they had to hire people and buy equipment to do it, so you can make that comparison and try and do things that are best for the people you're serving. And that's a key difference between having the public interest or the public entity involved in that process versus purely private. So introducing that community conversation and that public entity into that process is a key aspect in getting what the community wants, needs, deserves, and really serves them to the best for the economics they're paying involved, right? So that from my perspective, I don't think you need to dictate that, but I do think there needs to be some work done there, some due diligence to decide what's the best.
Now, you've moved from building Ammon, which was based on an improvement district model, to finance it, where neighborhoods built the infrastructure. Now you're working with a variety of communities. Is that going to continue, or are we going to see cities using this open access and interesting financing approach, but not doing improvement districts? What are you seeing from the cities you're working with now?
I think you're going to see a mixture. I mean, the improvement district is a great model, but let's be frank, there's going to be an infusion of money that's available to a lot of these communities. And it depends on whether or not they're unserved or underserved, because if they fall into either of those categories, wow, there's a lot of options they can tap, and they can funnel that in there and really change their situation. But even with the ARPA money, okay, you could
the American Rescue Plan Act money.
Yes, you could use that money based on how the rules play out. You would be able to use that money to change the dynamic, change the model. In other words, it's not enough to build everything in your community, but what it is enough to do is to pursue this idea of open infrastructure, to pursue this idea of how do we change this, and you can build yourself a foundation that is sustainable. That's the most important part. And then you can start to figure out, how do we get to these harder areas? And I think that's the role a lot of this money that's going to become available is going to be played. Is we're talking with cities, that's how they're looking at it. How do we strategically use this to get us started, knowing that we're going to have to continue to make an investment?
Preston, I want to ask you a question that's coming out of the chat, and then Seth, I want to get your perspective on it too. What is the role of wireless? We have new options available. It's this thing called CBRS, which we don't have to go in technically, but it allows entities that do not have vast spectrum holdings to, like cities, for instance, can deploy wireless in ways that they could not several years ago. How is that changing things? And do you see that as a solution that should be pursued rapidly?
A lot of people like to ask this question, and even when people describe stuff like "I want Wi-Fi," they mean they want the internet, right? But they know it by this notion of the internet comes from the air or something like that, right? I alluded earlier to the idea that there are sort of like foundational layers that stack on top of each other for infrastructure that ultimately deliver you internet service. Everything, no matter what it is, ultimately goes back to fiber. It might be really far away from you, dozens or more miles away from you, or it might be, in your basement or on the street. But wherever the fiber ends, there are many, many different modes of transmission. And Monkey Brains is known as a wireless internet service provider, or a WISP. The vast majority of our transmission from building to building is over wireless links of varying types, varying licenses, varying pieces of the spectrum. Absolutely, various, CBRS, LTE, what have you. These things deliver data. I think that what's interesting to me about this conversation about infrastructure is to reestablish and recognize: have we covered the foundation of, like, how close do you want that foundation of fiber to be to you? So it's a question of money, it's a question of labor, it's all understood. But if you can establish how close you want that to be to you, and to speak to the previous conversation about public money and public ownership, I definitely think that the foundational layer in the vast majority of cases should and must be democratically owned and democratically controlled. That's the foundation of keeping the country together and our communities together. From that point forward, how you deliver service to your remote house, to some other remote location, point to point, is up to you. And I think that various technologies do it for varying reasons really well. And I'll end with a quick quip. a certain maker of carrier grade, high speed, up to 10 gigabits wireless equipment told me once that one of the towns that they sell the highest volume of equipment to is a town that has 100% fiber to the premises internet. And that's just to point out that, like, you haven't like closed everything off with a certain piece of infrastructure. It actually opens up so many more possibilities that varying types of wireless connectivity can provide for you, local private networks, whatever. That's up to you.
And Seth, I want to come to you in part because I feel like, if I remember correctly, you have a significant physics background. You have science in your title. You think about these things deeply. I've heard elected officials, not today, but I've heard elected officials say on other calls that we need new technology to solve the competition and rural challenges that we face. And that's what we need to focus on. What is your impression of that? Do we need like a new wireless technology to get at these areas that you're trying to build in?
No, I don't think so. I think it's really actually a matter of raising the capital to build the existing technology and deploy the fiber as close to the premises as is economical at the time. The wireless solutions all have physical limitations based on geography and just how well the wireless signal can propagate in the atmosphere. And there's many geographies where wireless can make sense in very low density areas. In the plains, you can build a high tower, it reaches lots of homes. That can make sense in places where there's only, say, 5 or fewer homes per mile. But even at those low densities, that doesn't make sense in a mountainous area or an area that has a lot of foliage. White space technology can maybe fill in the gaps temporarily. But our analysis shows that in most places, over a 30-year life, a fiber build is actually the cheapest way to attach people, because the wireless technology inevitably needs to be replaced. The routers need to be replaced. They break. It's always adequate, but never future-proof, as is often said. So you're always replacing the wireless equipment in order to maintain the adequacy of the connection. Whereas if you build a fiber network, then all you have to do is replace the boxes at either end. You can do that every 10 years, and you've already gotten the connectivity that you'll need for the next 5 or for 10 years, and the cost of that is much lower. So, long-winded way of saying that it's unlikely that there's a technical solution that would meet the needs of America for the next 30 years, right?
I know
you could meet the needs in the near term, but that is a waste of money. Thinking of it from a governmental perspective, where you're trying to invest taxpayers' money in the most economical way, and that's going to put a foundation for innovation and economic growth, over the next decades, which I think is what we all want with our taxpayer money and our government funds. Can I, Chris, just go back to the other point a little bit on the financing side? What we've looked at in many ways, in parallel to what Joanne was saying, is bringing in partners like electric utilities that can offer a lot of advantages, sort of like those telephone companies that you were mentioning. In some places where the telephone companies either aren't existing anymore or don't want to play that role, the electric companies can play that role. They need fiber for their own grid modernization and maintenance. They need fiber for smart grid modernization, as I just said. And so they can use some of that to also offer broadband in some way. And there's a lot of different creative ways that can happen without having the electric utility be the ISP. A lot of them don't want to be the ISP, but in some way they can facilitate the fiber deployment. They can contribute capital to it. And generally, they all want their communities to have modern connectivity, because people will not consume electricity if they do not have broadband access. They will leave, they won't move, people aren't going to build houses, they're not going to have jobs, all those sorts of things. So that's a great partnership. Another way in which we see this finance playing out is to use philanthropic dollars in the form of a program-related investment to help coordinate these different partnerships. To Bruce's point, the philanthropic dollars can help structure investments that go to those really hard to reach areas. Not necessarily it can be hard to reach in the low density sense, but just hard to reach in the sense of figuring out all the moving parts and the players that need to come together to make it happen. It doesn't necessarily need to be a whole lot. What we've looked at is there's a development capital piece, which is often just a few % of the total build cost. And then on the actual financing side, even just 5 to 10%, either in the form of a direct equity investment, a subordinated equity, or some type of loan guarantee, that can make a big difference in these projects and putting the capital together, de-risking it for the debt, and making it happen.
I want to follow down that line a little bit about what can be done. And Joanne, I'll ask you, and I know you work with clients of all sizes, but if you're in an urban area and you're inspired by this to figure out what role your community can play, where do you start? And then I would like everyone to comment about the areas they work in with a similar question of what do you recommend people do with this information?
Well, if you haven't done this already, I think the starting point is defining the challenge that you care about, or the many challenges, and then prioritizing them. Don't start with the technology solution or the project or the investment. Start with understanding what's missing, what are the gaps, where are the challenges, and what is your community most focused on? Is it affordability? Is it competition? Is it actual availability? Is it the fact that there may be availability and lots of folks are choosing not to go online, or effectively not really choosing, but are in a position where they simply can't because there are other pieces missing. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to start by understanding the problems rather than by deciding what the solution is and then working backwards to figure out whether it's going to fix the problems. That's sort of a given. But assuming that you have determined that the challenge is indeed an infrastructure challenge, as we've been discussing here today, and you are interested in some kind of an infrastructure investment, then I think geographic prioritization is another consideration. Like, is this targeted, or is it a community-wide thing that you would like to work on? And the other question is, to what degree do you want to do this yourself, and to what degree are you seeking partnerships? And are you perhaps in a position where a partner could do some parts of your community and you could do others? But if you start with these kind of core foundational questions, as opposed to, I want a new network, and I've—
Right. If I could interrupt for a second, if I define the situation, my problem is I want better broadband. Is that a good problem definition?
No.
Okay.
Because why? Right? That would be my question. And by the way, I don't mean to insult anyone with this. I just mean that we are in a space where I think the flavor of the day, for example, CBRS is incredibly cool right now, as is low Earth orbit satellite, right? There's nothing more glamorous than SpaceX's Starlink network right now. Is it a solution for your challenges? Maybe, maybe not. Is it going to work at scale? Maybe, maybe not. But starting with that of like, there's this cool new thing, it's CBRS, it's going to solve all our problems, is not a way to do it. Collecting data, analyzing rigorously, understanding where your community is and where the gaps and the challenges are, will then point their way toward technologies and infrastructure and solutions. I guarantee it. And it's a much lower risk way to do things than starting with a technology solution. By the way, as an aside to that, there are 1 million vendors out there who are going after every city, county, town, parish in America right now and telling them we've got the magic technology solution. Starting with the solution, not starting with the problem, and they promise it will solve all problems. You will protect yourself from unscrupulous vendors and salespeople, and even the scrupulous ones. You will protect yourself from even the scrupulous ones if you start by collecting data, understanding your community, understanding where the needs are, and then you'll be able to better react to the proposals that are being put in front of you, because everybody has an idea about how communities should be spending their money right now.
And for people who are wondering, Joanne's coming to us from the rainforest today, so it's pretty exciting. Joanne, I agree with what you say. I'm going to pose another hard question. I don't want to play Bruce off of you all day, but Bruce, I feel like you and I would agree that ultimately we do want fiber to be everywhere, but I also agree that we shouldn't just start with that as our animating principle. So how do you think cities should be starting to think about this as they recognize they have a problem?
So Chris, I think that if I can I go back to the question you asked? You want better broadband, okay? Mm-hmm. So we're talking about infrastructure. I think most of us recognize, you know, it could be an infrastructure problem, whether we want to debate that or whatever. But let's say you want better broadband. The challenge you've got is there isn't anything you can do, not as an individual. The problem is you've got to get together as a community because you've got to be able to aggregate that demand. You've got to be able to collect it. And you've got to, and it's going to take that kind of a financial resource to actually come up with a solution. So it's a strategy. It's a strategy that the community has to develop to address what is it we want. So Joanne's right. What's the problem? And then we've got to get a strategy. And then you've got to go do it. So in answer to your question, I would tell people, you've got to start talking about it amongst yourselves. You've got to collect together with people that see it the same way, and you've got to reach consensus. And that's the big problem is we can't reach consensus about how to come up with a strategy to get fiber everywhere or whatever the infrastructure is that we think is the solution. I think personally, in answer to your question about fiber, if you're really talking about a 50-year investment, you can talk about wireless all you want, but you already heard it from these other panelists. If you look at it on a longer term strategy, we're kicking the can down the road if we do wireless because we're going to change it out all the time. We're going to be rotating that equipment all the time. Fiber is the best long-term investment, but the challenge is you've got to come to consensus. You've got to get leadership, and that leadership's got to look in and dig into the details and determine what's really best for us in our situation. So I don't know if I answered your question or if you want to re-ask it, but hopefully from my perspective, listening to the conversation, that's what really needs to happen. People need to be able to come together and agree on a strategy. And we're really struggling to do that as a nation, and it's costing us.
I think that's, I mean, I don't think that that's contradictory to what we heard from Joanne. I think Joanne's, point of view is that yes, but I think also that we don't want the gearheads to drive the discussion, in part because if everyone could just go out and borrow the money to build a fiber to everyone, that would be easy. But in a lot of communities, they have to pick where they're going to go first. And I think that's where you need to do this work to make that question and then to make a political process that will create support for it. Seth, I'm curious how you react to that.
I think you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good enough, so to speak. So, certainly on a 50-year basis, fiber generally is the cheapest form of connectivity. But there are low density areas where you'll spend a lot of money to bring fiber, and if that makes the project, if that imperils the economics of the whole project, maybe a wireless interim solution at that low density makes sense. It's a balancing act. I mean, it's hard. These places also are all electrified, right? So it was worth 100 years ago bringing electricity to them, and they faced the same density challenge as fiber does. And the choice was made, to Bruce's point, the choice was made to bring them electricity. So ultimately, they should have fiber, I would say, or whatever connectivity best meets their needs. But in the near term, you do have to be a little careful, I think.
Preston, you deploy fiber and wireless. I feel like sometimes we treat these decisions like they have this finality. I mean, with what Seth just said, I feel like you're sort of laying out for a town and you got, 30% of the costs are in a small fraction of rural houses. Maybe you punt. That's not permanent. It's a 5-year decision. You got to replace those radios. At that point, you're reassessing whether or not it makes sense to bring fiber out, I think. Does that make sense?
Well, spending your money smart on the front end is what helps you spend even more money later on, right? And
I think you mean avoid spending even more money later.
Or yeah, sure, you're right. Or you generate enough economic, well-being or enough economic return to have a community that can do things like voluntarily spend extra money to build an even better asset down the road. Wireless can do amazing things. It is not permanent. It is active. I definitely, whenever I talk to anybody who's making some money decisions about this, I tell them that, the vast majority of public money that you spend should be spent on the right of way, the conduit, et cetera, and the fiber that will be passive assets for the very, very, very long term. And I also want to pick up, because I really liked Joanne's very direct, no, it's not the right question, or the desire to say, I just need broadband. It made me think of a couple more things. to try and answer some of these questions. We've talked so much about fiber. This is a conversation about broadband, but to sort of like see some other directions that we could go with regards to spending our money on infrastructure, or what's important for us as a society, as a community, is on the one hand, you know, communities ought to have an idea or a notion of taking back control of the things that people need to participate in society, and not simply farming them out to a profit center that is separate from the community at large.
Preston,
And
I think you're leading right into what I want to, I'll give it right back to you in a second. You can be the first one to answer this. What you're talking about, taking back control, the people who are in control really don't want to give it up to the cities. And so I'm really curious what cities are facing, what we're seeing in terms of the kind of tactics we see from the established cable and telephone companies to try to discourage these innovative solutions. What are you seeing, and what threats, and what can we do to get around them?
well, we know in the past they've utilized the American Legislative Exchange Council to by right ban the construction and financing of public networks, which is an incredibly undemocratic practice. We know that they, to adopt the phrase, no one ever got fired for hiring IBM, right? There's a couple of super large incumbents today that no one ever got fired for making a deal with, to throw up some Wi-Fi hotspots somewhere and calling that, right? Their interest is in the sunk cost in their infrastructure. And Dr. Michelson put it so well at the beginning. We effectively the failures that we live with today are the world we live in from the infrastructure they built, and which is why we need to do something so different. I think that generating living examples of the alternative reality you want to see in partnership with government is a necessary first step. Just to overcome the first concrete hurdle. This community doesn't have enough access. Kids can't, the internet's always going down at this housing site. People don't have the ability to hang out in the park because there's no Wi-Fi there, and we want to socially distance safely, and people, should have the ability to use their phones, use their laptops in this park. Solve that one problem in conjunction with the community and the agencies capable of helping you build this long-term, we're taking control of our infrastructure plan. And from there, you begin to see the bigger problems that you can solve that actually do carve out a really strong space to combat the incumbents.
Bruce, you're in Idaho. We see a cable company that doesn't even serve most of the state, seems to be setting the agenda. What do we do about this?
Well, I think Preston's right. I think we've got to have some models that work. We need to demonstrate that we can change the existing model, and that some public participation does affect positive change, and it doesn't kill competition. I think that's another key thing, because the rhetoric you're going to hear from the cable companies, who by and large are winning the war. I mean, they're basically turning into a monopoly today. There is not a legitimate competitor in the territories they serve. And as we're saying, they're blocking competition, and they're avoiding any kind of rate control. So their philosophy is to say that these public infrastructures like Ammon built, or like other cities would build, are going to kill the telecommunications industry. It will destroy their livelihood and their services. But that is absolutely not the case, because many of these entities that go in and complain as lobbyists are actually using Ammon's infrastructure today. And they're making thousands of dollars a month off of Ammon's infrastructure. That does not get repeated. And the challenge is, they can say what they want to say, but it doesn't really get challenged. The public entity has to be very, very careful about what it says, and it has to be exact. And we don't have quite the same forum or the same voice that these private entities have in many of these areas. And that's part of the challenge. So I think we just have to demonstrate in more than just Ammon, more than just Westminster, and we have to build some credible examples. And then we're going to see it propagate, and we're going to see a lot of the policy shift to allow these things to happen.
Seth, are you operating under the radar, or do you have a target on your back that you feel?
I think we purposely tried to stay under the radar.
Well, I'm sorry for putting you on the radar.
I mean, we've made a purposeful choice to focus on areas that the incumbents have left behind. And that they generally do that because the density is too low, and it's not, even if an project is financially viable, it's not going to offer the returns that private equity or the incumbents are looking for, their shareholders are looking for, and so we're pretty much under the radar. I mean, I'm struck that I think this problem has faced our predecessors with regards to electrification, how to motivate capital, how to serve low density areas. And the solutions at that time are probably the same solutions that make sense for broadband. There's some degree of public ownership. There's some degree of cooperative ownership. The cooperatives are, incredibly successful for bringing electricity to rural parts of the country. In many ways, they provide electricity better than the IOUs.
Investor-owned utilities.
Yeah, they're investor-owned utilities. Their capital costs are higher per passing than they are in an urban context. And then, there was a time when there was regulation, as Bruce said, to sort of socialize the costs and make sure that all Americans were served, regardless of where they lived. I know, Bruce, I agree with you absolutely. It'd be great to have good models for municipal or cooperative or nonprofit or some other community-like organization that's building broadband, but we can also go look to the electric sector for organizational examples that have solved this problem 100 years ago when the choice was made to electrify the country. It took a long time, right? It took like 10 or 20 years, but it was done in the middle of a war, and it was done. So,
Joanne, I want to ask you about a specific thing, which is you helped form the Coalition for Local Internet Choice, one of the co-founders crusading against the state barriers. But one of the practical limits that I see when communities build a network is that they may face predatory pricing. I mean, they might face stiff pricing, but also we've seen some places, particularly with Charter Spectrum, where Charter Spectrum is offering prices that are guaranteed that they are losing money on it year after year. What do cities do when they face that kind of threat from an opponent that is willing to just lose prices to make sure that the new network cannot get market share? It's an easy question for you.
Well, when you're doing your business and feasibility planning, anticipate that your competitors will use every tool at their disposal to make sure that you cannot compete with them. And I think inevitably a public network or a public-private collaboration is going to have to find ways to compete that are things that they are uniquely well suited to. And let me put aside, there are obviously antitrust concerns. There are anti-competitive concerns with what you just described, Chris.
Big time.
I can't speak to that from a legal standpoint, other than to say that I think we would be better off as a nation if we had a different way of thinking about competition and ensuring competition and reducing anti-competitive efforts by incumbent monopolists. But putting aside that, which is something over which I truly have no control or even influence, and thinking about the things that can be done in a community like the small competitive fiber to the home providers who are ably competing against Charter and Comcast and other incumbents in many markets.
These are companies like Sonic and Monkey Brains, for instance.
Exactly, perfect example. Monkey Brains is in some pretty competitive markets and it is managing to compete. And I'm sure pricing is one of those factors, but it is not the sole factor, because if pricing were the sole factor, it would be a race to the bottom and everybody would be in significant trouble other than the very large companies. So my observations of how municipal and private small competitors compete and what they have that is truly unique is they compete, number one, on customer service, which is something that Charter is not well regarded for, may care about, but seems unable to really deliver at the same level. This is a structural advantage a small provider has, and they compete on levels of service. If competition is only about pricing, it's going to get very, very challenging quickly. We have to be able to compete at the local level, even though those public networks will be undercut on price. It is inevitable. And if the model assumes that you're going to be able to bring down your own pricing, I think there's a fundamental flaw in it. And the assumption that you're going to be able to increase pricing over time, even just to reflect inflation, is also in some ways fundamentally flawed. Pricing is one of those things that's going to be the toughest part. I hope that answers the question without making it even more hard. But
it's a hard question
of the market risk issue.
I'm curious about. I was just losing it. I'm sorry. We have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that we touched on Governor Newsom's issue. That's what I was losing. And so Governor Newsom has proposed $7 billion. We have Seth and Preston. By virtue of being in California, I feel like you're on the hot seat. You have any you want to describe it or comment on it?
My understanding is that there's a strong loan component at concessional rates almost, and I think that's
$500 million from the state to help localities to finance.
So we think that a loan type effort is really the way to go. That's what was used for electrification 100 years ago. Makes a lot more sense than grants. It's a better use of taxpayers' dollars. Loans are the way they have been structured in the past. They're also how to say it politely, they're harder to game the way that you can game grants. And so you get good projects and that's an efficient use of funds. Another way of doing it is to guarantee debt rather than to actually offer loans itself. So the state of California could guarantee debt that the communities raise. It doesn't seem like that's on offer, but that would be another very efficient use of money for these projects that have a long lifetime. Right.
I could be wrong. It's happened once or twice. I actually think that fund can be used in that way. I think it might be partially first loss, but I think it's been a hard week, and the proposal just came out on Friday.
But right, exactly. That's why. But it is. I think it is a smarter. We think it's a smarter way to use money from a taxpayer's perspective to loan it rather than to give it away. And you're going to get better projects out of it.
The other big piece of it is open access middle mile. Preston, any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just perspective from working at a smaller independent ISP. We have multiple fiber providers that everything goes back to fiber. Yes, the vast majority of our network is wireless, but we love working with various fiber providers. And we also love not having to own the entirety of the very farthest back core backend, which is one of the reasons why we love being in the fiber to housing partnership, because getting this public entities to construct public fiber is great for small ISPs like Monkey Brains. And so I think that it has a lot of promise. We're in a place right now where we actually, as a society, we have to spend a lot of money on infrastructure from the middle mile and the first mile all the way to your unit, but the money we should start with should be spent on a statewide or comparably sized regional open access, ideally as much as possible publicly owned and controlled fiber network. And to do that will allow a lot more opportunities for ISPs like Monkey Brains to help solve problems for communities across the state. As we go on and more money becomes available, if we were to simply take California as a single example, we would want to, having completed a robust, highly available throughout the state in many different endpoints middle mile network, you would then want to see that money invested in getting it closer and closer and closer to as many people as possible. But this is the best place to begin spending that money.
And Bruce, any reactions to the California plan, or which is my way of saying, what's your wrapping up comment? You can feel free to take that however you wish.
I agree with Seth. I think, that's really the appropriate place for the state to engage, is to enable the projects. And I like the fact that they're talking about technical advisory committees. This is not a trivial matter, but it's something that municipalities could take on if they wanted to take on the operations with a little bit of training. I think the thing I'd say in wrapping up is there's a place for everybody at the table. And Seth pointed out there's cooperatives, there's public infrastructure, there's private service providers. And when we talk about open access, that's really what we're trying to do, is provide more competition. So it's not really about killing any one person. It's about a strategy that puts us on par with the countries that have leapfrogged us and takes us from being 19th or 20th when it comes to access and cost and moves us back up the ladder. And so I think, focusing on a strategy for a good infrastructure that'll serve the communities and making that open is a way to do that.
Seth, just a 30-second closing comment.
Echo Bruce. I mean, I think the end goal is broadband, cutting edge, modern connectivity to all Americans. And however it's best to achieve that, that's the way we should go. And what's appropriate in one community may or may not be appropriate in another community. I think also, to Bruce's point, to reiterate, technical assistance, pre-development funding, sort of also echoing Joanne, how to put these projects together, what's the problem that needs to be solved. Each community is a little different, critically important. If California just says, well, we're going to spend $8 billion in one way or another, but doesn't also, if the communities don't have it, or if there isn't some other mechanism so that the communities can plan for that and structure their projects for that, then it's probably not going to be effectively used. So something to think about.
And Joanne.
I'll just say it's a remarkable moment. 25, 28 years after the advent of the commercial internet, we finally as a nation are giving this issue the level of prioritization that it needs and has long needed. And if you're a community, now is your moment.
Thank you. And I would like to wrap up with a closing comment that says, this is a time when we have unprecedented amount of funds coming from the federal government to localities. I think we need to have a prioritization without rushing. This is not a moment to rush into anything. It's a time to actually do the due diligence, and to make sure that the communities are developing plans. I'd really like to see every county have a digital equity plan. We've really focused on infrastructure here, and that needs to be a part of a digital equity plan. But everything from getting devices into kids' hands, adults' hands, getting training out to folks, we need these plans bubbling up, and then to be funded, ideally by the sorts of government programs that we're seeing. I think philanthropy can play a really huge role in getting that planning started. And so I really hope that we see more of that. And we take advantage of this moment. So with that, I think, Miguel, you're going to come in and tell me I went 2 minutes over, but I hope it was worth it.
Thank you so much, Chris. Most definitely worth it. Very strong message, and one that we were hoping our philanthropic sector, our sister foundations, would definitely hear today. Thank you to all our panelists as well for the very fruitful conversation. Before we go, we'd like to share with you one of our most recent wins in combating digital inequity here at Michelson 20mm. On March 8th, we launched our inaugural Digital Equity Spark grant funding cycle. Through this program, we sought to surface projects that support systems level initiatives with potential to create positive impact at scale and inform public policy around digital equity work in California. Our focus areas included education and awareness, research and scaling best practices through our Spark grants. We introduced an innovative just-in-time grant-making process to meet the urgent needs of organizations aligned with our focus areas. Our Digital Equity Spark grant funding cycle closed on March 29th, 2021, and awarded $125,000 to 5 innovative projects. These include Everyone On, Mo Human, the Public Policy Institute of California, Unite LA, and the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Together, the grantees' projects embrace a multidimensional approach designed to address the complex challenges of digital inequity. On the ground, Mo Human is launching a San Diego pilot program to get 3,000 low-income residents connected, an effort they intend to scale across 22 promise zones and internationally. At the same time, Everyone On is designing a digital inclusion training program for K-12 organizations, nonprofit organizations, and those providing public housing. But in order to spark lasting change, further research is needed. For this reason, USC Annenberg will map connectivity down to the residential block via their Connected Communities and Inclusive Growth project. CCIG is expanding the platform to cover the entire state of California, while also increasing the scope of the project to include digital literacy and broadband speed indicators, among other enhancements. Similarly, PPIC is examining how digital equity gaps have evolved from the spring of 2020 to the present. Their findings will culminate in a report designed to arm change makers with more accurate data and actionable solutions. Finally, the LA Digital Equity Action League, LA DEAL, led by Unite LA in partnership with the LA County Economic Development Corporation, is a community-driven cross-sector consortium that will address digital equity challenges by sector and region. Topics include broadband infrastructure gaps in low-income and underserved communities, affordability, reliability, and speed of services, adoption, and device access. Through the combination of scalable solutions, research, and education, the 5 coordinated and complementary projects truly address every dimension of the digital divide. We are proud to partner with these groups to increase digital equity throughout the state of California. These 5 partners join previous grantees, the Foundation for the Los Angeles Community Colleges and the Education Trust West. Please keep an eye out for a 20mm.org blog and a series of blogs spotlighting each of our new grantees and the inspiring work that they are leading to eliminate the digital divides. This installment of Connecting California was presented by the Michelson 20mm Foundation in service of advancing digital equity for all students and families. We want to thank our foundation partners, the California Community Foundation, the Angel Foundation, and Southern California Grantmakers. We'll post a recording for today's discussion on our YouTube channel, the Michelson 20mm Foundation, by tomorrow, and include links in the video description so that you can join our Connecting California LinkedIn group, a dedicated space to foster collaboration amongst California's philanthropic community to advance digital equity and close the digital divide faster and together. As we continue on this journey together, we'd love for you to share your thoughts with us to continue to improve our efforts. In the chat and in the follow-up email, you'll receive a link to a survey to give us your feedback. Please take a moment to fill it out. Every bit of information helps, so thank you in advance for taking the time to complete it. If you or your organization want to become part of our digital equity work, please reach out to me personally at miguel@20mm.org. You can also stay engaged by signing up for our newsletter at 20mm.org to receive news and updates about Connecting California, as well as our other events and programs. If there is any media present, please stay on the Zoom line for a few minutes. We'll be happy to take your questions. If not, thanks again for joining us, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.